I am bad at paperwork and better at excuses. That is how they drew me into the middle of this. The envelope they handed me is thick and cream-colored, the sort of vellum used by archivists and by people who believe solemnity can be manufactured with fine paper. The man who gives it to me does not slide a business card across the table. He says a parish name I remember from childhood, and the sound of it makes a small, old fear uncoil inside my chest. His hands smell faintly of sealing wax and stale communion wine. The crest stamped into the wax is an old thing. 3 crossed keys above a rose, an emblem you see in photographs of locked rooms and closed archives. There is no return address, and the envelope carries the silence of something meant to be obeyed rather than answered. I open it at my desk under a lamp that makes everything feel more honest than it is. The sheet inside bears a list of names, neat columns of surnames and parish towns and dates when last seen. At first, the entries could be the kind you file away: travel notes, people moved, pastoral duties. But the notes in the margins are not clerical platitudes. They are instructions and verdicts written in 2 distinct hands, one careful and italic, the other jagged and breathless. Beside some names there are single words in Latin: elevatio, clausus, processus, and a column that records weather with an unnatural specificity: east wind, heavy fog, thunder at sunset. I should have stopped when I reached the second page. I should have folded the paper back into the envelope, put the seal down, and refused the curiosity that keeps me up when I am meant to sleep. But I do not. Curiosity, in my life, always begins as a minor sin and ends by rewriting the ledger. I trace a name slowly with the tip of my finger. The handwriting in one of the margins looks like my own when I am hurried and careless. The loop on a particular K is identical to the loop I make in the margin of my own notes. My mouth goes dry. The list contains a name I know: Father Matteo, a discreet man who once officiated an evening mass in the neighborhood where my mother used to take me to light a candle. When I look up the parish online, I find nothing wrong and everything staged to reassure. The website photographs are bright and ordinary. The mass times are current. The bulletin lists youth groups and soup kitchens. I go to the parish because these assignments are work, and work answers questions even when the answers are small and made of dust. The bell does not ring when I arrive. Doors are closed. A man in a tabard greets me and offers coffee that tastes of burnt sugar and a metal tang. He says Father Matteo has been on leave. He says the phrase with the measured tone of someone who has been trained to accommodate questions that should not be asked. The photograph on the parish facade looks too bright for the doorway I stand under. The facade is an advertisement for safety. I leave with a cup of coffee in my hand and a taste of iron at the back of my throat and a feeling like a door being shut quietly behind me. I call Sorrentino, the archivist who seems to have been born with a pencil tucked behind his ear. He meets me between stacks of parish records and letterboxes that smell like old glue and prayers. He taps the corner of my page with a finger and says the word committee, as if it were a diagnosis, and he draws a small pencil sketch of the crest from the seal. He tells me there was an office once tasked with irregular cases, and that lists were their way of managing what otherwise would become scandal. Lists, he says, turn people into records. Records are easier to move. He speaks like a man who has catalogued too many things that would prefer not to be catalogued. His warning is gentle and exact. It suggests not only physical danger, but a moral machinery in motion. I find the ledger in a room that is not on any official plan, a chamber behind altar stone and old mortar that hums with stored warmth. Metal carts hold tins, and each tin is stamped with a name and a number. The clerks who work there handle the tins with the calm of people who learn to reorder grief into inventory. They slide lids off with the sort of care you would use to close a child's coffin. When a lid is removed, the air that rises is thin and cold and smells like something kept too long in the dark. I am allowed in because curiosity has its own permission slips, and the monks know which questions will be asked and which ones will not. I am not allowed to take photographs, which is why I take a page later that night as if theft could be a form of prayer. I am a poor thief because guilt makes me clumsy. I fold the paper into my coat and feel the bulge like a pulse. At home under a lamp, I spread the sheet and trace the lines until the edges blur. Marginalia turn into instructions. A rubric drawn from the Rituale Romanum has been altered with notations that start to look less like commentary and more like a schedule. One column lists times, another weather, a third a word that reads like verdict. The page feels alive in my palm. The ink refuses to smear under my thumb, and a new line appears at the bottom, as if someone were writing with a pen I cannot see. I should have taken the whole thing to Sorrentino, and then to an authority, and closed my mouth forever. I do not. I am not made for that kind of safety. After that I sleep badly. Ledger pages turn in my dreams, and the names whisper in a language that sounds like mass in a room with no ceiling. When I wake, my fingernails are stained black, as if the ink has left me something to remember. The paper in my pocket is still warm. I try to destroy it in a furnace room beneath the parish hall, because there are things you think you can unmake. The match catches the corner, and the flame curls the paper, but the letters do not vanish. The ash settles in a pattern, and for a moment I think the ash is spelling back to me the loop of my own hurried hand. I stamp the remains and leave with the false comfort of action. Later, I open a newspaper, and a photograph of a parishioner is annotated on my page with a date 3 days ahead. I pass someone on a corner, and their name appears in the ledger at a time I have not yet lived. I should have left the city then, dissolved the whole sheet and the memory in acid, and slipped away. But I follow threads until my hand trembles and the pattern completes itself. Tonight the last line on the page contains a date and a street I know from when I was a child. It ends with a single sentence that feels like a mouth closing on a secret. Your turn. I should have stopped when the ink bled. I did not. Now it writes ahead of me and waits. I arrive at the parish in a thin afternoon that feels older than the day itself, as if the sun had been saving its warmth for some other hour. The church sits modest and stubborn against the street, its stone pocked with time and the kind of small repairs communities make when they want to forget that anything went wrong at all. I tell myself this is a simple case. Routine check, ask a few questions, file the form. The bell is silent when I push the heavy door, and the silence is not empty. It is careful, as if listening for the name I will give it. The nave smells faintly of wax and dust, and a memory that people pretend is pious. I move inside because habit is a safe thing, and because sound tends to tell the truth even when faces lie. The organist is a silhouette among pipes, hands hovering above keys like a pianist uncertain of the next note. He does not play, but the air around him collects a kind of after-sound, a residue of music that gathers at his wrists and drops to the floor like dust. He writes on the hymnboard with chalk in a hand that grows confident as he finds breath. The usual canticles, the coffee morning, a line for choir practice, and then a single date that catches my eye and pulls like a stitch. The date is written in the same hurried loop I have used in margins of my own notes, and for a moment I feel the odd, private sensation of recognition that announces danger. Parishioners file in with choreography that is almost pleasant. They fold into pews like paper dolls, shoulders angled the same, hands placed at the same mark on the bench. Faces I know from the soup kitchen offer polite nods. When the hymn begins, their mouths do not move the way mouths should move. A wet sound issues from throats between breaths, a suggestion of syllables meeting a membrane and aborting, as if the language is attempting to climb, but finds its ladder removed. I stand at the back and watch a woman I remember laughing at a fundraiser last year. Now her jaw is slack, and there is a tide of sound behind it that is not speech but the memory of speech. The choir's voices swell, and the congregation remains a study in patient stillness. In the sacristy, the linens are folded with the kind of tenderness that is almost obsessive, silver burnished until it seems guilty of its own shine, and the crucifix over the credence table leans a fraction to the right. The holy water font is shallow, and the surface ripples in a way that refuses to reflect what stands before it. Behind a stack of bulletins, I find a hymn list annotated in 2 hands. One is a careful, clerical script, knotting readings and psalm tones, the other jagged, hurried, as if someone took notes while time itself trembled. The marginalia speak of late bells and lights in confessionals, and a clock that stutters when a certain name is read aloud in another parish. The pages smell faintly of chalk and iron. A child from the choir brings flowers forward in a motion that is small and ritualized, placing the bouquet at the altar with the tender cruelty of someone trained to make something look alive. Her fingers arrange the stems with a precision that suggests repeated practice in keeping appearances. At the base of the altar stone there are fresh initials, shallow and raw, the edges still crisp as if carved by a nail overnight. My name sits there, thin and precise, a sentence left incomplete. For a maddening moment, I think I have imagined the carving. Then I press my thumbnail into the groove, and the stone rejects me with a cold that goes beyond the weather. I find a ledger hidden behind hymnals on a shelf that should be occupied only by songbooks. Its leather spine is swollen, and the stitching across the fold forms a crude cross. Inside are entries that read less like baptismal registers and more like maintenance notes for mysteries. The bell did not peal on August 12. Confessionals glowed though the building was locked on April 17. The organ stopped at the exact minute a name was spoken in a house 3 parishes over. Each entry is clinical and small, precise as an inventory. Someone has been cataloguing failures and quiet things, as though the house keeps receipts for what it has swallowed. A thin cleric with a clean-shaven scalp and eyes trained not to smile watches me with the soft courtesy of someone used to curious visitors. He says, with the flatness of a catechism, "Some bells forget on purpose." It is not an explanation, it is instruction. He tells me the town cannot hold certain phenomena, and so the precinct stores them, a ledger that turns people into records so a city can continue to sleep. He speaks of containment as though it were mercy, and explains that the house reorganizes what would otherwise be scandal. There is a steadiness to his voice, like the steadying of a surgeon's hand before an incision. I should have left when the altar went suddenly cold beneath my fingers, and the congregants blinked, as if someone had taken a photograph of their faces. I should have gone when the hymnboard showed a date I had not yet lived. But I do not leave. I step toward the choir because the floor seems to incline toward the sanctuary, and once you notice an incline, your steps follow it, as if you are completing a sentence you did not expect to read. The organist looks up, and his face is like a page with a sentence erased, familiar and wrong. And when he asks me quietly whether I remember a hymn I learned, as a child I answer, because habit makes me obedient. The chalk dust on my fingers will not wash away easily. When I leave the church, the bell tolls, late and wrong for the light, its voice trying to stitch the hours back into a clock that has lost teeth. People step out blinking, hands rubbing their eyes, as if awakened from a communal dream. My fingers are dusted with chalk, and I sleep that night with images that turn like prayer beads, confessionals where light swims like fish, the organist's hands hovering, the child arranging the bouquet as though setting out bones. I should have left when the altar turned cold. I did not. I kept stepping toward the choir, curiosity a sin that became a ledger, and now when the bell tolls I hear it say my name if it has been waiting. The ledger is not where a ledger should be. It is hidden behind a false brick in the vestry, behind hymnals and folded linens, tucked into a niche that seems almost apologetic for being there. When I slide the brick aside, the room exhales a smell that sits between wax and rust. It is a domestic rot, patient and precise, the perfume of things that have been counting for too long. The leather spine is soft in a way that suggests more handling than use, and when I open the book, my fingers prick at the edges of the pages, as if something inside had been waiting for a touch. Pages are full of names. They line up in neat columns. Name, parish, date last seen, notation. The entries read like civic records until you reach the margins, where the hand changes from clerical neatness to an urgent shorthand. The margins bloom with symbols, tight ticks that open into spirals, crosses that split and multiply, loops like small labyrinths. Someone has turned absence into arithmetic and annotated departures with weather and cadence, the time of bell towers and the direction of wind. It reads like a ledger and like a ledger's confession. I recognize names in those rows. Father Matteo is there, inked twice with slightly different hands, as if 2 people recorded his exit at different moments. There is a name from my childhood parish, a godmother who used to stitch my coat. Beside her entry, a small sigil resembles the curl I make when distractedly looping my pen. I feel my stomach tighten because superstition in a ledger reads like a personal accusation. I am trained to treat records like inert things, inert and dull. Yet the ledger resists that categorization as if it prefers to be noticed. At first I tell myself fatigue plays tricks. I sit beneath the single lamp in the vestry and trace the margins as a scholar might trace a palimpsest, fingers hovering over symbols that burn like cold. A faint motion seems to darken an unfinished line where my nail has passed. I pull my hand back and the room hums with normality. A clock somewhere coughs, a distant dog barks, footsteps in the street. The small change in ink could be a coincidence. I am a man who has learned the cost of superstition by paying attention to consequences, yet the ledger tempts that worn lesson. I take the ledger. I'm not noble about it. I fold it into a cloth like a thing I am ashamed to possess and carry it home with the furtive gait of someone committing a petty theft. At my kitchen table the lamp pools light and the ledger breathes as if reading over my shoulder. I open it, and there are notes I did not notice in the vestry. Faint tally marks buried in margins, small notations beneath dates that accumulate like counting beads. One column seems to be a running tally of departures. I chart a few, and the arithmetic grows teeth. I begin to see pattern. When a margin tally reaches 5, there is a disappearance reported in the region within days. Weather notes correspond to fogs and sudden storms. Times match vesper bells and house closings. There is no magician's flourish, no theatrical prophecy, only arithmetic. Marks made, marks echoed by events. My rationality mutters alternatives, confirmation bias, selective memory, but the ledger continues to add up in a way that does not bend to doubt. I should have returned the book then, slipped it back behind the brick, and pretended I had never found anything. Instead, I make spreadsheets, ridiculous and ashamed, because proof is a poor salve against fear. When ink shifts deliberately, the motion is intimate and patient. It does not scream. A line darkens, as though a breath has warmed the paper. A new mark appears in a corner where before there had been blankness. My first reaction is the ridiculous relief of proof, like a detective who finally reads the cipher. My second reaction is the cold wash of recognition that comes when a pattern completes and you realize you have been implicated in its completion. The ledger seems to like being observed. It answers. I bring a copy to Sorrentino. He is careful and precise, the type who measures margins and keeps his pencil behind his ear as if memory were a tool to be accessed. He looks at the facsimile and offers a taxonomy: palimpsest layers, ink migration, chemical seepage. He offers normal things as an anchor and names the phenomena I was already namming in my head. When I press about the tallies and the correspondence to disappearances, his face loses a portion of its color, and he says, quietly, that there is institutional memory in odd formats, and sometimes, very rarely, records attempt to manage what nature will not. After that, I begin to dream in columns. Parish addresses fold into the spaces between sleep and wakefulness. The margins inhabit my peripheral vision when I am awake. Sometimes the symbols collect at the back of my eyes like dust and resolve into letters that spell Clausura. I wake with my chest heavy, as if pressure has been laid upon my ribs, and the ledger is a physical ache in my coat pocket. My hands begin to smell faintly of iron and chalk. I scrub them in the sink, and the scent recedes only to settle again like residue. On a grey morning, the tally next to Father Matteo's name hits 5. I finish my coffee, and the radio announces a search. The announcement is clinical, but the undertone feels like one of those civic rituals that quietly admit when something has been taken. I fold the ledger and place it back behind the brick, but the brick fits less false now. It closes like a mouth. I convince myself returning the book is an offering, a containment. I tell myself ritual in the right hands is mercy. I should have walked away then. Instead, I watch the margins, like a miser watching a ledger grow. Days later, in a lamplit room that smells of rain and old paper, I open the book again, and a new tally has darkened as if with intention. Beside it, someone has scrawled an addition in a cramped, unmistakable hand. A date, a street, an initial. The ink looks like it was pressed into the page by the weight of a breath. My first instinct is to tear the page, to scatter the ash into the river and wear that as penance. My trembling fingers cannot bring myself to do it. I fold the sheet and slide it back into the place where the brick will hide it, and the ledger goes quiet as though satisfied. I find that night, when the city is thin with rain, a new tally appears as if ink was pressed from the air. Beside it, someone has written a single word in a hand that feels like mine. Begin. I should have known better. I did not, and the margin smiles quietly. I find the apartment 3 flights up, a narrow place that smells of other people's cooking and old prayers. The door stands ajar as if asking permission. The air that meets me is ash and paper, dense as memory. Books lie open on the table, and on the floor, pages singed at the edges but not eaten, as if flame kissed them and then kept the secret. The crucifix above the bed tilts a fraction, offered at an angle that implies some negotiation with gravity. The books are not only breviaries and doctrine. There are pamphlets bound in thin parchment, diagrams that look like maps of mouths, and notebooks stuffed with slips of paper. One notebook is open with handwriting that slips between Latin phrases and a child's script, as if 2 voices share a single hand. Beside it is a small digital recorder, its plastic warm as if someone had only just put it down. The voice on the tape begins as Father Antonio's and then grows thinner, receding from intimacy into a coldness I do not trust. The prayers play backward, and the syllables fold in on themselves so that petitions resolve into promises. When the tape loops a phrase that resembles an oath, the flat seems to lean inward. The crucifix's shadow stretches toward a corner that refuses to be cornered, and the air tightens. I take photographs because habit is a rope in a storm. The flash slaps the room into a false clarity and reveals details that lurk in gloom. Crescent burns along the windowsill, a rosary bead blackened as if dipped in soot, and a photograph pinned to the corkboard where smiling parishioners have had their faces scratched out with patient cruelty. Someone has moved through this flat with ordered violence, leaving margins of damage like index cards in a library of rage. A stack of newspapers tied with a frayed ribbon holds a scrap with a notation, a time, a street, and in the margin a small cross and the single word, done. The handwriting is precise, the kind that keeps lists as if lists could discipline fate. I trace the ink and feel a chill where it sits, as if the letters themselves remember the hand that pressed them. I should have filed the photographs and turned the recorder over to Sorrentino. I should have placed distance between myself and evidence. Instead, I sit on the edge of the bed and play the tape until it begins to play me back. The playback folds my own breathing into the track, making the flat feel smaller, as if the walls had been trained to accept my sound. The reversed prayers become invitations that name streets and times. Then, with the patient cruelty of rumor, they pronounce my name. There is a kettle recently boiled, though no cup waits, an ashtray with butts still warm, a lamp dusted with fingerprints, as if many hands handled it in recent hours. The recorder calls an alley I know. I go because curiosity is a bad habit, and because you sometimes prove nonsense by walking it. On the iron railing of that alley, someone has carved an initial that matches the handwriting on the scrap. The coincidence tastes like metal. Enlarged, the images show a residue that arranges into faint sigils and the faint outline of a name pressed into wood. I copy the recording to my phone. I photograph the corner the crucifix favors and later study the images under a lamp, noticing textures the naked eye missed. A residue that resolves differently as my phone tilts, the ghost of letters that seem to reappear when the light shifts. I tell myself I am collecting data, that I will hand the messy thing to those who varnish fear into procedure. My hands betray me. I make lists to translate chaos into tables. I write observations in a notebook and attempt to reduce them to a spreadsheet. The ritual comforts me because cataloging is a way of refusing to be swallowed. The recorder's phrases refuse obedience. Times become instructions, streets become coordinates, my name a margin note. A pattern emerges that is accounting rather than omen. When marginal marks reach a certain count, the ledger's arithmetic seems to shift the city's unwilling geometry and someone vanishes. When the tape speaks a time aloud, I mark it, as one marks a tide. I go to the alley at the appointed hour because habits are persuasive, and because sometimes the world keeps appointments without explanation. I return with my coat wet from rain, the carved initial under my thumbnail, and the sense that I have been present at a small transference, knowledge whispered into form. The recorder now feels less like a piece of plastic and more like an instrument tuned to a frequency that wants my attendance. I sleep poorly, as if someone has altered the thing that measures rest. Dream and wakefulness stitched together with new seams. The tape's phrases loop behind my eyelids, and the crucifix's tilt keeps a steady counsel in the center of my vision. I wake once with ash under my nails and the taste of burnt paper in my mouth. The snapshots I took look less like evidence and more like talismans. Every image seems to rearrange when I blink. Faces shift at the edges, and a name that was absent a moment ago appears in the grain of the table. I go to Sorrentino and show him the recorder and the photographs. He is a man who handles paper as if it were a living thing, and whose fingers have taught him the cautious art of not being surprised by old things. He opens the ledger and runs his thumb along pages that have been counting absences for decades. He does not say the words that would make this a closed case. Instead, he murmurs something in Latin that feels like rounding a hinge, conventus secretorum, and tells me quietly, "Careful what you carry." Those who catalogue the vanished bind ritual and administration into one another. They note weather, bells, and small times as if to pacify the accident of disappearance into something predictable. For the living, it is a kindness. Records mean that absence has been acknowledged, but for the ledger's margins, it is obligation. Once entered, the tally seems to do a small, merciless job, and the world rearranges to balance its accounts. I feel like a clerk with the wrong keys. I go home and listen to the recorder until its phrases are old friends who know all my jokes and none of my limits. The tape names a church on the far side of the river and a time when its bells are supposed to ring 3 sharp notes. I plan to stand where the bell should speak and listen. I tell myself it is professional curiosity, a necessary step toward closure. I should have filed the photos and run. I did not. I keep listening because the recorder, in its small, stubborn device, will not stop speaking my name until I answer. I am tired and certain, and also deeply afraid of the ledger's patience. I am the one who is late to answer. I work at night because the day is too loud and full of faces insisting on ordinary things. The chapel on Gervasius Lane looks freshly respectable, plaster laid over older shame, a small building that keeps itself tidy in case visitors judge it. I have been inside for routine checks before, light bulbs, heat, inventory. But tonight the door yawns under my hand like something surprised to be asked. The air inside is lime and rain, and the faint, agreeable dust of prayer. The seam along the floor near the altar is a thin line that a careful eye would notice. I press my thumb to the boards and feel the give under years of footsteps. The plank lifts with a sound I have learned to read, a sigh stretched by time. Beneath is warmth, not the cold of rot, but the small, wrong heat of something that has been kept like a pocket creature. My fingers find linen. The parcel inside is small and wrapped with a patience that suggests hands that know how to bind a secret. When I unfold the scrap, it is a rectangle torn like a page from an exercise book. A child's hand has scrawled a name across the top in thick letters, MARCO. Below the name there is a list of dates, short and irregular, each line like a notch taken from a stick. The dates gather in clusters then spread. They are not random. They have the arithmetic of someone trying to make order out of fear. The air under the floor is wrong in a way that resists words. It feels young and close, like a mouth held at whisper, and when I move the scrap, the scent of ash and riverweed curls from its edges. I set the scrap on the altar and take a photograph even though I know photographs flatten presence into proof. The flash makes the linen look thinner, a thing of evidence rather than life. At first the dates look like a child's log of days, fairs, a cousin's birthday. Then the pattern becomes unmistakable. The clusters on the scrap align with nights the ledger in the vestry marked as thin, noted with small tallies. When 5 marks gather, the ledger often records a departure nearby. The correlation is ugly in its regularity. I compare scrap and ledger as if reconciliation might be mercy. The pages meet across the table like conspirators. I should have closed the gap and put the plank back where it belonged. That is the sane commandment. A sealed thing is kinder when left sealed. But the part of me trained to catalogue keeps reading. While I trace the child's dates, my chest tightens. The last date on the scrap is tonight. The knowledge arrives like cold water on a burn, sharp and absurdly precise. The chapel changes when I look at the scrap with that knowledge. Candles gutter though there is no draught. The statue of Saint Cecilia seems to lean as if listening. I watch shadows become attentive, and the hymnals sit warmer than they should, as if recently closed. I find myself counting minutes, an absurd habit that feels like both prayer and superstition. I take the scrap to Sorrentino, because one is not supposed to keep such things alone. He is a small man with a pencil habit who makes sensible noises at the edge of terrible ideas. When I show him the child's list, he thumbs its corners and does not smile. He says carefully that institutional practices, lists and ledgers, turn mischance into maintenance. He uses the word containment in a tone that makes the room feel colder. After that, I sleep poor and brittle. The child's dates nest in the dim between wakefulness and sleep, ticking like teeth. I sit in a pew with my coat wrapped and watch the wall clock move as if it wants to hurry. At 00:10, my pulse begins its own counting. I wait because curiosity is a bad habit, and the ledger's arithmetic taught me to watch margins like tide marks. At 00:12, the chapel seems to inhale and then let go. The floorboard where I first found the scrap makes a small sound like paper sliding against paper. I kneel and pry the plank free. There is no bundle now, no linen-wrapped scrap, only dust arranged in a faint oval as if something small and counted had been removed. The place where the name had been is a ghost of impression. Someone is in the back of the chapel, standing very still. They move without the hesitancy of a living person. The gait is smooth, practiced, as if rehearsed. When they turn, the face is a stitched photograph of the town. A neighbor's mouth, a child's laugh, a faded portrait. Recognition should comfort, but here it becomes accusation. I stagger back because the face contains too many memories that do not belong to any single pair of eyes. I should have closed the gap and left it sleeping. I tell myself that and then reach for a notebook and write the child's name because namming feels like a ward. My pen shakes. When I look down, the child's dates have been added beneath my handwriting in a hand not mine, neat, insistent. Tonight's date is circled. Outside, a bell rings, dull and late, carrying across wet streets. The sound folds into the chapel like a thin hand closing a book. I leave with the weight of the scrap in my pocket where I cannot plausibly say I meant to keep it, and I walk the wet streets like someone who has learned a measurement for dread. My footprints fill with rain and erase themselves behind me. When I look closely, the reflection is not wholly mine. Letters drift across the glass, and for a moment I cannot tell whether the script belongs to me or to the city. Panic rises, and I press my palms to the cold window until the shopfront blurs. The child's dates bob in each pool of light, an insistence I can no longer shrug off. I try to be practical. I log the dates, cross-check the vestry ledger, call an old contact under false pretext. Each step feels like stapling evidence to a confession. The scrap in my pocket rubs my thigh like a living thing. At home, I spread the entries and map them until the kitchen table looks methodical. The arithmetic is brutal. Where the child's marks cluster, people vanish. I should have closed the gap and left it sleeping. I say it aloud like a prayer, and it does not keep me. I keep the name in my head and the scrap folded, and I wait for the clock to strike the minute the ledger suggests. I should have stopped when the ink bled. I did not. Now the margin's right ahead of me, and my handwriting answers back now. I find him in the vestry where lamps smell of oil and old paper, a man in a black cassock, arranged as if for a photograph. Each fold deliberate, each hand practiced. He has the collar of a priest and the calm of someone trained to answer questions with certainty. When he intones the absolution, it begins properly and then slips a wrong syllable free, a change that reshapes the prayer like a hinge shifted in the dark. I say nothing at first. I'm trained to notice nuance, clerical errors, procedural lapses, because that attention has kept me from careless mistakes before. The man folds his hands with the grace of a liturgist and moves through ledgers like a man who knows which papers must remain visible and which must be wrapped. He produces a pamphlet from an inner pocket and lays it down as if passing a rosary. The seal impressed on the fold is the same emblem I saw on the envelope that started this. He speaks of rotations and promotions in a voice that is both administrative and pastoral. The missing, he says, have been reassigned to duties beyond the parish. He uses ecclesiastical nouns with managerial verbs and thereby makes displacement sound like duty. When I ask what elevated means, he smiles and offers a half answer about service that will keep the city whole. The language is persuasive because it is polite. Civility has a way of softening cruelty. There are small things about him that make my skin prickle. He can mimic ledger marginalia, the little ticks and symbols that mean everything to a recorder and nothing to a layman. He knows where to leave an unsaid line that the book will finish. When he laughs, the sound arrives too clean, as if polished by rehearsal. When he reaches for a folio, the light catches his palm, and I notice a tremor that I did not expect in a man so composed. At the cabinet glass I see my reflection, and it flinches. The man behind me in that silver looks like me, and is not me, layered over my own face like a watermark. It is a reflexive truth. Reflections tell small prophecies. I should have trusted it. Instead, I ask for names, because the ledger has taught me to ask until the page yields an edge. He slides a folded sheet toward me with the casual solemnity of passing a sacrament. The paper bears a parish, a name, and a time. The ink is neat and cold. The seal is warm. Holding the paper feels intimate in an astonishing way, the authority of someone else's decision pressing into my palm. Lists create order, he says, as if reciting a catechism. Order prevents panic. He talks of balancing accounts, as if people were ledger entries, and the politeness of his diction makes the term sound almost humane. I am ashamed that his civility disarms me. When I press about feeling and consent, he replies with a rhetorical question, whether the sea feels pain, turning my ethical demand into an abstract. He keeps his hands visible. He shows me the fold of a cuff with a tiny burn, the faint impression of letters on his palm, things that suggest recent contact with paper and fire. He is not a horror enacted by grotesque form. He is a bureaucracy with habits of care. Bureaucracy is tidy violence. It categorizes, stamps, files, and thereby makes disappearance administrative. I should have left when my reflection jumped. I should have taken the sheet and torn it in half and walked out. Instead, curiosity, this old, dangerous engine, drives me to open the paper. The name is an ordinary parish entry and the time modestly precise. I fold the paper and feel the ledger's gravity pull at some small internal seam. The world seems to rearrange around that point like a quiet calculation. Later, I trace the loop of the script until the ink hesitates beneath my finger. The pamphlet's seal leaves a faint indentation on my palm that will not wash away. I go to the parish named and find the neighborhood ordinary, laundry on balconies, a cat asleep on a stoop, but ordinariness is camouflage in this case. The church door is open, and a bell strikes a measured rhythm. The man who greets me at that parish performs rehearsed charity. He answers questions with the right gestures and the right pauses. He smiles when I ask about rotations and uses the parish bulletin as if it were scripture. The civility weakens me because it looks like ritual. I should have left when the pamphlet burned my skin. I did not. When I step back into the street, the folded sheet sits heavy in my pocket. I tell myself I will make a report and file it. I tell myself that someone will put the paper into an envelope and set it in a drawer, and the problem will be reduced to a note. I tell myself those lies because they are better than the small truth that accompanies this paper. The ledger moves differently when observed and answers when read. The name sits like a stone at the base of my tongue, and I taste paper and wax. Behind me, in the vestry, a book closes with a soft, decisive sound that seems to mean more than a book's closing. The man watches me leave, and his smile is the polite sort, not cruel, but with a satisfaction as precise and small as a stamp. I should have believed the little flinch in the glass. I should have trusted that mimicry is not identity. Instead, I walk toward the appointed parish and feel, absurdly, like a petitioner taking his turn at a confession one cannot absolve. At home, the paper narrows everything. I spread it under the lamp, and the ink seems to shift like soft geography. I cross-check dates with the vestry ledger and the pattern tightens. Clusters of marks precede absences. Where the notes align with strange evenings, bells fall silent before a name vanishes. The calculation is obscene in its calm. I think of burning the paper, of scattering the soot into the river, but superstition and duty contort inside me. I make a map instead, pinning names to streets, drawing lines until the sheet looks like a net. Each intersection is a small accusation. My hands tremble, the pamphlet's warmth lingers. I'm a clerk who reads prophecy between columns and pretends that paperwork will be a remedy. The more I map, the more the city answers, as if the ledger expects to be read. The corridor smells of dust and oil, a thin perfume of things kept moving. The stone is warm under my palm as I follow the monk. Brother Gallo, he says, though his face is the sort of face that has learned to be careful with names. The key he gives me is heavy and cool, an old thing with teeth like a cipher that seems intended more for secrecy than for locks. He speaks once in a voice so small it could be a prayer. Not all rooms want witnesses. The words should have been instruction enough to turn me away, but they do the opposite. They pull me deeper, past the choir and beneath the ordinary liturgy into a passage that seems designed to swallow footsteps. The door opens into a space that is both quieter and louder than the parish. Quieter because the ordinary world has been pared away, louder because every object inside insists on its past. Shelves climb into shadow, and the shelves are full of tins, metal, stamped, lined in rows like a museum of small mercies. Each tin has a nameplate. Clerks in dark coats glide along narrow aisles with the economy of those who index lives for a living. Their carts whisper on stone, and their hands move with machine patience. A crucifix on the far wall is wired into a small array of meters and blinking diodes. Cables run like veins, and the whole display hums with attention more than with power. The air tastes of pewter, and the taste lodges in the back of my throat the way guilt does. Open ledgers sit on lecterns, pages layered with ink until they become palimpsests of disappearances, entries overwriting earlier entries like a city sanding its wounds. Margins breed marginalia, and marginalia breed tempers. The handwriting of decades collides with the shorthand of a few recent hands. I learn quickly that this room keeps accounts for absences the world prefers to forget. It catalogues not just names but circumstances. Whether bell tolls, windows open or shut, the direction of a wind. The clerks make lists, as if lists could straighten an event into something manageable. Brother Gallo moves with a confidence I do not have. He knows which tin corresponds to which parish, which number denotes an absence of a certain sort. He taps a lid with his knuckle, and it answers with a quiet rattle, like a cough. At a long table, a clerk places a blank faceplate near a small mechanized press, a cast-iron tool with a seal like a coin. The ritual is administrative but tender. A name is read aloud from a ledger, the clerk listens, another clerk validates, and then the press descends. The metal imprint is like a coin stamped with a portrait. The sound of it is not triumphal but decisive, a small bell that records rather than rings. They hand me a clipboard because method has consolations. I am told to note provenance, weather, and any irregularities. The tasks are innocuous, the kind of instructions that make monstrous things look like paperwork. The ledger's hand is patient and precise. I write beside an entry with the nervous steadiness of someone pretending that recording a fact is equivalent to preventing what the fact describes. When a tin is slid toward me, I read the nameplate and recognize a face. Father Matteo. My throat goes dry. The clerk opens the tin, and inside a folded photograph lies like a closed eye. Someone has scratched away the irises. The image looks less like a portrait and more like an indictment. A bell somewhere in the room chimes, 3 soft notes that feel at first like an ordinary signal. But then it steps backward, and the sequence contracts until it is counting down. The sensation is ridiculous and intimate and full of meaning. The bell counts its own reversal, as if undoing time might make absence reversible. I should have run then, because a bell counting backward is the sort of small disaster that insists on being noticed. Instead, I watch, because the mind mistakes the role of witness for control. I keep watching as the press is brought down and a new face is stamped into metal, the imprint cold and final like a signature. Brother Gallo offers explanations that sound like mercy because they are wrapped in administrative language. We preserve what would otherwise break the city, he says. We file absences so the rest of life continues. The rhetoric is neat. Containment, order, balance. It is the kind of polite logic that disguises cruelty with civility. His hands are careful when he slides the tin back into place. The clerk who read the entry does his work with the same ritual respectfulness one would give to closing a ledger of births. Bureaucracy here performs the sacrament of erasure and calls it procedure. The clerks move like shadows, pushing carts of tins, their movements smooth and practiced. The room's meters blink in a rhythm that feels less like time than like attention. When the press is used, the small bell in the corner chitters once, a sound that stitches a registry closed. Outside, ordinary life continues. Coffee, dog walks, a child dropping a ball. While inside this back office, men and women transmute a human absence into an itemized record. My pen feels absurd in my hand, a tool for pretending distance. I make notes, map names to streets, and try to believe that mapping is a way of resisting whatever arithmetic the room practices. When I rise to leave, the key in my pocket is warm and heavy. Brother Gallo nods without malice, his face offering the quiet satisfaction of someone who has seen a newcomer accept a role he will come to occupy. The corridor yawns long as I walk back through the choir. The organ's notes spill like ordinary promises. I should have run when the bell began counting backward. I did not. I watch the clerk stamp a face on a new tin, and at night the tins find me in sleep and wake, a clatter under ribs. The stamp presses on my palm like a coin I cannot spend, and in quiet the ledger adds a line I have not yet written. I should have run. I did not, and now I carry the key and its debt, and the room counts my footsteps softly. I find the furnace room beneath the parish hall by following a corridor that smells of coal and old prayers. The door is heavy and resists me, as if unused hands remember the weight. Inside, iron and brick hold a low, private heat. Somewhere a pilot light sighs like a tired animal. The ledger in my bag feels absurdly important, the sort of object that insists on being handled in stages, like the confession it might be meant to hold. I tell myself I will burn it cleanly, that ash will be the end of names, that flame will be a simple absolution. The match I strike is small and thin and feels like a sacrament. I let the flame catch the corner of the leather, and the paper curls away in an answering hiss. For a few seconds the world behaves the way I expect. Ink blackens, edges darken, the book shrinks inward. I imagine the ledger's grip loosening, names dissolving into hot air, obligations turning into soot. I do not imagine the ledger resisting like a thing with memory. When I blow the ember, the ash does not scatter as if blown by a normal breath. Instead, the granules shift and gather, assembling into letters. At first I think it is a trick of light and my own tired brain, but the ash spells a date and a street with a crispness that jars me. The handwriting is small and exact. The loops are the loops I make when I am nervous. The letters in the soot form a sentence like an accusation, and the smell of burned paper seems to taste like a question. Smoke curls up in a column that smells faintly of iron and laundry, as if the city is exhaling a ledger. It smells of my mother's tea kettle and her moth-eaten cupboard in a way that makes my chest twist. The smoke leaves a residue on the lamp glass and on my fingers. When I wipe my hand, the soot resists and takes root under the skin, spreading like a bruise. I scrub and scrub until the raw skin reddens, and the ash bakes to a crescent under my thumbnail like a brand. I know, in a way that is both professional and obscene, that I should walk away. Evidence should be handed over, procedures followed. A book that moves should be catalogued, not fed to pyres. But my training is mixed with a child's belief that fire will absolve, that flame is a simple end. The ledger will not cooperate. It keeps correcting itself like a patient typist, inserting a line where no line was before. I drag the remainder of the pages into the flame, but every ember that dies seems to write itself anew in the pile of grey. The ash rearranges, letters forming from cinder as if a ghostly hand traces glyphs in soot. I watch, helpless and fascinated, as the ash spells my mother's surname, then a time, then the word begin. The furnace eats the paper and returns an imperative. I feel the pages heat in my palms, and the book's last leaf curls like a lip. Panic arrives not as chaos, but as accounting. I make diagrams and maps on the back of my torn envelopes because mapping seems like resistance. I trace the dates, connect streets, annotate weather notes. Each connection feels obscene, as if I press a thumb into an old wound and measure its depth. I carry the ledger through rain to the canal with the absurd intention of throwing it into blade-dark water and letting pages fall and fade. On the bridge, I hold the book over the dark current and cannot throw it. The ledger flips on its own, and I close it, unable to toss it into the water. At home, I spread the ash and the remaining pages across my table, the lamp casting a halo that feels suspiciously like an altar. The soot marks on my fingertips transfer to the paper and my notes, and increasingly to my skin. I rub and the stain embeds deeper. Each morning the print looks older. Friends ask if I am well. I lie and call it a cold. I begin to dream in marginalia and wake with the taste of coal in my mouth. Sorrentino studies the photographs of the ash letters and makes small, careful sounds like someone counting beads. He does not invoke prophecy. He says instead that records sometimes behave like the things they record, that paper carries habits. The sentence is offered as comfort and as warning. It steadies my head and robs me of an edge of denial. If paper can act like memory, what remains for the living but to watch how it moves? The ledger's arithmetic tightens. Marks in the margin increase by ones and twos. A neighbor's absence, an old teacher's quiet moving away, a child who misses school for a week, small losses that balance into a statistic. When the tally beside my mother's name goes up, the kitchen, where I visited her last, blurs in my mind like a photograph left in rain. I tell myself chance accounts for coincidence. The ledger's patience argues otherwise. At night, the soot under my thumbnail seems to crawl toward a word I cannot bear. The ash rearranges in dreams into a clock with my name at the center. The hands move with polite certitude. I wake sweating, and the residue on my fingers is like a relic that will not be reliquified. I sleep with the ledger beneath my pillow, and proximity misleads me into a taste of control that is only illusion. I try to destroy what I cannot own. I email notes and photographed letters to colleagues and friends, half hopeful that scattered knowledge is safer. Attachments fail to send. Files degrade into static as if the ledger will not permit multiplication. The words refuse reproduction. The book seems to resist being made neat by other hands. My attempts to erase the soot only deepen the stain and tattoo the letters into my skin. When the next tally increases, I know it before the phone rings. The city seems to synchronize with the book. The sky adopts the color of a page. I trace the ash on my palm until it hurts, and the ledger seems to breathe out an instruction. I make a small, futile list of precautions. Avoid unknown numbers, skip the chapel after dusk, hide the ledger in a closet beneath hymnals. None of it helps. The ledger's arithmetic creeps around these measures like water around a stone. Each precaution reads like a confession I cannot admit aloud. The book keeps tally regardless. It watches me and waits for my error. They usher me into a room that never made it onto any official plan, a chamber whose door bears no name yet carries the seriousness of a vault. The corridor smells of lemon oil and old paper, a domestic attempt at disguising secrecy. At the center of that room, a long table waits, dark and polished, its surface reflecting faces more than light. At the head sits an elder with linen hair and steady hands, a man who speaks with the calm of someone who has taught generations to accept hard facts. He does not raise his voice, because the room is used to receiving instruction. They call their work closing the circle, and they say it with a tone that renders the phrase ceremonial. The explanation is two parts administrative, one part theological. A hidden office absorbs irregularities to spare the broader city the shock of disorder. Disappearances are thus reframed as elevations. The missing are entered into a quieter registry of service and discretion. The clerks speak of rotation and stewardship, and when they quote Augustine, it is to lend grace to a system that otherwise reads like calculation. The rhetoric contains mercy, but it is mercy given as accounting. The ribbon arrives like a sacrament. It is a narrow band of crimson silk tied around a folded list and handed to me as if I were receiving a chalice. The motion is ceremonial, precise, and utterly plain in its intent. On a small card attached there is a name, a parish, a date. The folded list is light enough to fit my palm, heavy enough to feel like something one cannot easily cast aside. I feel the urge to refuse because it is the right thing by habit and conscience. I do not refuse because the request flatters and obligation seduces. Portraits of former custodians line the wall, varnished faces smiling from before and after their tenure. Each plaque lists years, and then a word such as promoted or transferred, language that renders erasure into a discrete bureaucratic noun. A clerk demonstrates the ledger's mechanism: entry, seal, adjustment. In the ledger itself, names sit alongside marginalia, times, bells, weather notes, details that read like an accountant's table until the pattern emerges and reveals intent. The city adapts in small shifts, and these small shifts are the price of keeping the public surface intact. They ask me to read an oath aloud. The text is a peculiar braid of legal cadence and liturgical cadence. To preserve order, to accept elevation as mercy, to maintain confidentiality. When I speak the words, they fall from my mouth with a strange authority. I feel my voice adopt the steady timbre the elder favors. A signature follows. A key is handed over, and with the mechanical finality of pen meeting paper, the room breathes as if a machine has completed a cycle. They present the key like an instrument of ministry, and I accept it as one might accept duty. At home that night, the list sits on my table and feels like a small living thing. The top page bears names and columns and marginal notes, and as I study, the handwriting, a chill runs through me because some notations resemble the indifferent loops my own pen makes under pressure. I attempt to destroy what I hold. I set the corner to flame in the sink and watch the paper blacken, but ash refuses to disperse in simple obedience. The soot arranges itself into letters that form not a prayer but a schedule. The ledger resists annihilation as if it has learned how to survive. Dreams become rows and columns. I wake tracing margins instead of breaths. A neighbor's cough becomes a coordinate in my sleep. A child's missed day at school appears as a note. When I attempt to duplicate pages with a camera, the images blur into static. Scanned files corrupt before they arrive. The ledger seems to prefer a singular custodian whose touch answers its margins, and the book resists reproduction as if to compel stewardship rather than broadcast. Rationalization comes quickly. Someone must shoulder difficult choices. A ledger prevents panic. The phrase comforts in the cold way that doctrine sometimes comforts. We speak of tradition and necessity around that table, and the elder quotes Augustine in Latin in a tone that bends theology toward administration. He insists order is a kind of care. He shapes argument into a benediction. Several point to precedent, and to pages annotated in the hands of generations. They show small, patient notations that span decades. It is monstrously tidy. The ledger records weather and bell and time until absence becomes a reliable variable. The logic is elegant and awful, and it makes a kind of sense to people trained to prefer calculation to chaos. There are technical questions the clerks answer with charts and precedent. How many tallies justify elevation? Who decides proportionality? Which metrics govern reassignment? They have answers in ledger form. The explanation persuades because it is detailed. Detail soothes practical scruples in a way rhetoric cannot. They show me old entries where names yield to numbers and numbers smooth into policy. When I touch the ribbon, it leaves a faint impression on my skin, and I feel its warmth the next morning, even beneath my shirt. I should have refused when they offered the ribbon. I did not refuse. I keep the list as if custody might be a form of answering. The ink curls like a living thing against my palm, restless and patient. The ledger's margins have begun to add notes in a hand startlingly like my own. At times I think the book is writing me into its future as much as it records the cities. I fold the list again, because folding feels like concealment, and I feel the weight of the office settle at the base of my throat. The city waits with neat, terrible patience. At the kitchen table the ledger ticks in the same rhythm as my pulse, an exchange that terrifies and steadies me. Nightly I watch its margins and trust my eyes less with each reading. The act of witnessing feels like complicity and like worship. I tell myself I will be a steward, a keeper who prevents chaos, but the city has an appetite for order. The final line I cannot bear to read, my name etched in the margin and already waiting. I do not remember deciding to leave so much as noticing that my hands were already moving. The ribbon is still warm where it pressed my palm. The ribbon has a stubborn life like a vein. Outside the vaulted room the corridor tilts and the city waits at the lip, lamps like watchful eyes, rain beginning as if the sky wished to wash signatures away. I tuck the folded pages into my coat as one tucks a secret into a child's pocket and run. The key in my pocket is a cold, small hammer, and the list is a small, dense thing that leans against my thigh with the weight of insistence. Running through the city is less heroic than in the films. Feet slap wet cobbles, breath curtains, and roofs bloom with mossed gullies of rain. I cut through alleys whose names I know by memory and past storefronts that have been there since the same decade I learned to count. People move beneath umbrellas like a slow tide, and when I brush past them, I feel the ledger move against my leg like a heart. Each time I pull the paper out to consult it, old habit, stupid hope, the typeset shifts. Names rearrange themselves, as if the paper resents being read by others and prefers my hand. I watch letters inch like small insects toward my own entry, and the sensation of watching is a new kind of vertigo. Mirrors and shop windows become instruments of anxiety. My reflection no longer merely copies me, it rehearses. It fidgets before I do and sometimes looks past me, as if noticing someone standing on the other side of the glass. Faces of passers-by, ordinarily anonymous, pick up a ledger cadence, a blink that is one beat too late, a smile that seems painted in the margin. For a moment I imagine everyone is searching their pockets for the same heavy paper. The idea is absurd and contagious. A woman with a stroller glances at me with eyes like ledger plates. Her expression is exact and blasé, as if she reads columns the way others read weather. When I look back at the list, a new line has appeared in a handwriting only half familiar. Neat, the sort of steady script Sorrentino uses when he is afraid. I try to throw the thing away. I stuff it down gutter drains. I wedge it into the crevice of a park bench. I press it against a wall and walk on until the city swallows me. The paper keeps returning to my pocket, not by sleight, but by a stubborn law I cannot name. Once I set it on a rubbish pile and watched the rain pull ink into runnels that made arabesques I could not quite read. The paper lay sodden and mute for minutes, and then, when I reached for it again, the letters were dry and arranged, as though no water had touched them at all. The city seems less like scenery now, and more like a book bound in mortar, and every click and drip is a marginal note that waits for me to look up. Sleep is a dishonest thing. When I close my eyes, the ledger moves behind my eyelids, and I awake with ink under my fingernails that I do not recall earning. Once I find myself in a church, I do not remember entering, hands folded in apparent prayer, and the folded pages are warm in my coat. I am learning the geometry of anxiety, the way fear outlines a route, and I do not have the courage to avoid the path that outlines me. I call people I trust, and their voices sound like recordings with a faint electrical buzz, as if some frequency in the list has changed how sound behaves around me. There are moments of absurd clarity. A street vendor hands me a wrapper, and the grease stains in a pattern that is identical to the ledger's tiny looped scribble. A busker's tune becomes a cadence that matches the rhythm of the ink migrating. Coincidences line up with cruel perfection until rational thought jokes that the world has a good sense of irony. I tell myself the simplest things: exhaustion, stress, the slow fray of sleep. But this is not exhaustion. Documents do not rearrange themselves with my name in them simply because I am tired. At the river, I consider the old option. Burn what you cannot keep, scatter what you cannot own. The bridge is slick with rain, and the current looks capable of carrying anything away. I open the ledger under the street lamp and watch the rain collect in the ink like tiny ponds. For one terrible moment, I imagine the letters will run into nothing and the city will relax its teeth. Instead, the paper seems to drink the rain and become more legible. The final line, my line, stares back in ink so black it is almost a cut. There is a date and a place and a neat sequence of numbers that resolve into time. The margin holds a single, spare instruction: attend. When I put the paper back into my pocket, the city sounds like a throat clearing. The air tightens and noises around me contract to the width of a page. I try to outpace the list by changing direction, by taking buses and trains and routes I have not used since childhood. The names in the margins follow like small, tidy shadows. Sometimes they rearrange to make room for my entry, as if compulsion itself were considerate. Other times they shift to warn me in a language of dots and ticks I am only beginning to understand. There is a cruel logic to all of this. The ledger does not merely record, it requires. It marks and then waits. It is stipulative and liturgical in equal measure. It asks patterns of obedience the way prayer asks for repetition. I think of the priest who offered the pamphlet like a sacrament, of Brother Gallo and his key, of the clerks making small metal bells click into finality. The web is comprehensible in a terrifying sort of way. Names are nodes, tallies are currency, and someone or something somewhere converts this accounting into motion. I should have torn it and scattered the ashes into the river, I tell myself. Over and over the reproach appears like a footnote. Instead, I keep the list, and in that keeping, accept the ledger's grammar. The final line sits like a horizon in my palm, and the date ticks toward me with the polite relentlessness of bureaucracy. I look up from the paper, and the street seems to answer. A delivery van pauses. Its driver looks at me for too long, then nods with a flicker of recognition that is not friendliness but confirmation. The city feels like an audience, and I am the performer who did not audition for the part. When the appointed time approaches, my hands do not tremble as much as flatten into a bureaucracy of their own. I find the place the margin dictates, a square by an old fountain where pigeons gather with the insolence of creatures that know how to be bored. People pass by with their small, ordinary tragedies and their shopping bags and their lives, and none of them seem to notice the neatness of the line on the page. A bench creaks and someone swears in a language I love, and the world goes about its blunt business while the ledger counts down with the precise patience of a clock. A man sits opposite me, and his face is the weathered face of the city. He smiles the smile of a man who keeps his own marginalia private. He speaks without preamble and says, simply, "We all answer eventually." His voice is ordinary and terrible. I flip the paper and the ink on the final line seems to twitch like a small animal sensing a trap. I ask him who wrote the line, and he pats his pocket like someone checking for a handkerchief. "Not written," he says. "Arranged." The single word lands with the weight of a verdict. The fountain gives a small, indifferent splash. The man rises and walks away with the unhurried certainty of someone who knows his lines. I stare at the ledger until the letters blur into a single black seam, and for a moment I believe that if I look away the horizon will not approach. I should have torn it and scattered the ashes into the river. I did not. The list sits heavy in my pocket, and the city keeps answering my question in small motions. Doorways closing, a dog barking twice, a bell faint in the distance. And when I finally read the margin aloud, the pavement seems to inhale. The street answers me not in voices, but in the way the rain falls, and in that pattern I hear the ledger whisper the last, quiet sacrament. It was never written for me to refuse.